Hi guys, this is another Magical Mystery Church multi-feature. And today this video is from a series I did last year, and it is an article by Constance Cumbey about the family's hijacking of evangelicalism. And the reason I'm doing it right now is because I'm going to be uploading another series about Barbara Marx Hubbard and transhumanism. And I thought this would be good background information if you haven't seen it yet. It's a really good article about the, the yoking up, the equally yoked of a lot of modern evangelicalism, especially politically, like with the family in Washington, D.C., with the New Agers, like Barbara Marx Hubbard or like David Spangler, etc. And also, as you saw in the thumbnail, Tim LaHaye, who wrote the Left Behind books and was one of the founders of the CNP, the Council for National Policy, with Reverend Sun Myung Moon, the Moonies. Yes, the Moonies. So there's a lot of that mingling. So it's mostly listenable. It's me reading the article, but I have included several clips and different things from Constance Cumbey interviews, like the one you see right here, and some of her teachings. She was one of the first Christians back in the early 80s, after doing a lot of research, to write a book about exposing the New Age and, even how it has crept into the church and into Christian bookstores and different things like that. So, and I have read her book, The Hidden Dangers of the Rainbow, and also her book, The Planned Deception. And you can find them, and I will link them below. You can also buy them on Amazon, but I have linked them below. And she has generously supplied a PDF for free online. Anyway, so if you see this video, it might be good to watch the other one about Barbara Marx Hubbard, and this will all kind of make a lot of sense. So thank you for watching or listening.
The Motor City continues its battle with high unemployment due to a struggling American automobile industry. Yet the New Age movement continues to flourish in this city. A Detroit attorney named Constance Cumbey began to notice this in 1980 when she began a massive research campaign.
I'd go in there and I read practically everything in the store on prophecy and biblical commentary. And then I started noticing a different line of books that ran in their bookstores, and I noticed there were books from writers of many denominations. And the books didn't particularly sound like their own denomination, but they all sounded exactly like each other. There were books that called for the creation of a new world order. World Food Authority, World Water Authority, a new world information order. They would make frequent reference to the Club of Rome reports and a Global 2000 report, which was just coming out about the time I was heavily into this study. And the books looked very much like things I had seen in the old political world that I was no longer particularly active in. And it looked like what we would call a political platform. So I started thinking, isn't that interesting? Wouldn't that be convenient for the Antichrist? And I felt ashamed of myself as soon as I thought it. I said, well, these are Christian books by Christian writers. But my attention was riveted to those books, and I kept going back and looking, and I noticed the vocabulary was rather unique. Now, if there's one thing I've always prided myself on, it was my vocabulary. These books, things were done holistically. We didn't live on Earth. We lived on spaceship Earth in a global village on a very crowded planet. We all had to undergo this strange new transformation because we were entering a new paradigm. We had to have a new vision. Our old ways wouldn't do. Now that we were going into this new crowded planet, some of the books were saying that that there were truths in other religions as well that we should take a look at, that all the world's religions had the same central truths. And they were talking about courage for dialogue, and it looked to me like the dialogue was tilting heavily in favor of Eastern mysticism more than the Eastern religions adopting portions of Christianity. But I noticed that the books with the strange new theology had the very same vocabulary as the books with the very heavy political platform, and the books with the strange new theology would make references to the political aspects. I didn't start putting it all together until I picked up a copy of The Aquarian Conspiracy by Marilyn Ferguson. And she said that they communicated in the movement with code words and signals. She said the movement was large. She called it a great shuddering conspiracy, ready to overtake us. Page 37 of her book, she said in many different places at many different times, the kindling had been carefully laid for the real conflagration, the one that would forever alter the landscape. She said they had broken with certain key Western values, and whenever I hear that, I wonder which ones. And so I turned to her chapter entitled Spiritual Adventure Connection with the Source. And sure enough, she said we turn east for completion. Eastern mysticism, direct experiential religion was the order of the day. And I had noticed that trend through all the books I had looked through. She quoted from the Aquarian Gospel, and I picked up a copy of the Aquarian Gospel. And page 14 denied Jesus was the Christ. Page 16 said one may enter fully into the spirit of the God of force. And that rang a bell with another Bible verse I'd learned, he shall honor in his estate. The God of force is a God whom his fathers knew not, Daniel 11:38. That's the King James Version I was quoting from. And then chapter 14 of the Aquarian Gospel prophesied that one day a mighty master soul would come to earth, a light greater than Jesus, to light the way to the throne of perfect man. So I figured that was a direct satanic prophecy of the Antichrist. And finally, I picked up a book by Benjamin Creme. I found it in July of 1981. It was entitled The Reappearance of the Christ and the Masters of Wisdom. And it said, since July 19th, 1977, the Christ has been among us. Well, I had so many insane books from the New Age movement saying this kind of thing, I kind of disregarded that one. Put it aside until I was computer cataloging the collection in September. And I picked it up again and skimmed it, and the back had a section on how the plan is working out. Well, I had suspected that there was a plan, but I didn't expect to find an admission in writing that there was a plan. That was more than I ever dared hope for. And sure enough, he cited a lot of the components, things that I had seen in the Christian bookstores, even as evidence of the fact that the plan was working out. He talked about this move towards centralization of our food supplies and change of our economic system and of a new world economic order. And he said that they had hoped that the Christ would make his declaration by mid-1982 at the latest. And at that point, I skimmed through Benjamin Creme's bibliography in the back, and he had said he was an Alice Bailey disciple. I'd never paid that any attention either. And I thought maybe his bibliography was worth perusal. And he quoted from Alice Bailey at length and said he was her disciple, and in the back he said to read The Externalization of the Hierarchy. And he was right on target. That was the book to read. It was all laid out very coldly. Repeated references to the plan. This book was written many years ago, between 1919 and 1949.
And now I'm reading an article by Constance Cumbey. And I would like to thank John Brisson. He did a live stream on this, and I will leave a link below to his live stream so you can hear his commentary if you'd like. I just wanted to read this article myself, and I think it very much connects to the Empower 21, the New Apostolic Reformation. It's literal evidence that there actually is a merging of right-wing politics, conservatism, evangelicalism, Christianity, and the New Age. So here we go. The Family and Its Hijacking of Evangelicalism, Part 1, by attorney Constance Cumbey, on August 8, 2008. Now all the resonating core groups with outwardly different purposes are merging and blending and coming together to do the one work. And that's a quote by Barbara Marks Hubbard to a Unity Church congregation, Seattle, Washington, April 1988. The Washington Fellowship, a Washington, D.C. and suburbs-based Christian organization, has received much publicity in the past 2 years. Jeff Charlotte's new book, The Family, says it reveals the secret fundamentalism at the heart of American power. If only zeal for Jesus were what the fellowship was about, I might not bother writing this article, except perhaps to advocate on its behalf. Unfortunately, it is abundantly clear that any alleged fundamentalism at the core of the fellowship is much more akin to the New Age networking type than it is to Christian orthodoxy. Another prominent internet researcher, Wayne Matson, charges that the fellowship is using Jesus as a cynical logo in pursuit of cynical political pursuits. He goes so far as to call it a monstrous criminal plot to seize control of the biggest prize of all, the United States government. Years ago, the New Agers tried to pin the Jim Jones and his Kool-Aid mass murder suicide cult on what they called fundamental Christianity. I was happy to have played a small role in giving him back to his longtime New Age movement confederates. Jim Jones had been a New Ager from the beginning, listed in 2 major New Age directories in the early in the early 1970s as a New Age center networking with other New Age centers. Now that the family, together with its Doug Co. leadership, is being pointed to as an example of Christians trying to take over the United States government and beyond, it's time that the record be set straight. It is much more akin to a New Age operation than any Christian one. That the fellowship, sometimes known as the Cedars, is influential and powerful is hardly disputable, as the Los Angeles Times reported. While the annual breakfast is a widely known event attended by a succession of U.S. presidents and foreign dignitaries, the fellowship's role in diplomacy and current events has remained in the shadows. That's the way the organization wants it. What I have discovered is that the family and the Institute for Noetic Sciences, one of the most all-time powerful New Age organizations, have intertwined core leadership and financing. The fellowship did not come under my personal radar until late October of 1987. Colorado friends expressed me tapes of a David Spangler talk at a Boulder Episcopalian church. He explained to the audience that his talk to the Episcopalian church had been added almost as an afterthought. The real reason he was in town was to attend the latest in a series of ongoing meetings he had been having with evangelical Christian leaders. This last one, just finished, had been held at the Gold Lake Ranch near Boulder, Colorado. A prior conference had been held at Hollyhock Farms in British Columbia. That is another established New Age center. I wrote much of Spangler in my 1983 book, The Hidden Dangers of the Rainbow. David Spangler is the New Age leader who distinguished himself by writing in his innocuously named book, Reflections on the Christ, that the required entry point to the New Age was a Luciferic initiation. That may be the most honest thing anybody ever said about the New Age movement. Among many outrages in a chapter entitled Lucifer, Christ, and God, Spangler wrote, "The being who chose to embody these energies and to be in essence the angel of man's inner evolution is the being we know as Lucifer. The being that helps man reach this point, freedom, is Lucifer. That is his role. He is the angel of man's evolution. He is the angel of man's inner light. Lucifer is the spirit of light in the microcosmic world. When this great project of evolution began, man went forth as consciousness to learn his divinity, and Lucifer went with him. Lucifer was just what his name implies, the bringer of light. It is important to see that Lucifer, as I am using this term, describes an angel, a being, a great and mighty planetary consciousness. Christ is the same force as Lucifer, but moving in seemingly the opposite direction. The light that reveals to us the path to Christ comes from Lucifer. Lucifer prepares man in all ways for the experience of Christhood, and the Christ prepares man for the experience of God. Lucifer works within each of us to bring us to wholeness, and as we move into a new age, which is the age of man's wholeness, each of us in some way is brought to that point, which I term the Luciferic initiation, the particular doorway through which the individual must pass. Lucifer comes to give us the final gift of wholeness. If we accept it, then he is free, and we are free. That is the Luciferic initiation. It is one that many people now and in the days ahead will be facing, for it is an initiation into the new age. My path and the path of the fellowship were to unpleasantly cross in July 1988. I rather suspect they were aware of my whereabouts and work long before that. I rightfully suspect that events and donor trials of the fellowship had much to do with the fanatic evangelical leadership attempts to halt my work and question the very existence of the New Age movement. Christianity Today, InterVarsity Publishing, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, Campus Crusade for Christ, Multnomah College, Spiritual Counterfeits Project, Christian Research Institute, Denver Seminary Leadership, Vernon Grounds, and J. Gordon Lewis were among those joining hands in an effort to bring into question the very existence of the New Age movement on an organized level. Pat Robertson, Harold Bredson, and even some of those I counted as friends and allies tried either openly or surreptitiously to block my work. The motivating impulse for the frantic effort to deprive the Christian world of warnings of a movement publicly working for, number 1, a New World Order, 2, a New World Religion, and 3, a New Age Messiah, who was clearly not Jesus, may well have stemmed from major financial support and political ties with one of the most prominent and visible New Age promoters, billionaire, Harvard graduate attorney, Paul N. Temple. Paul Temple, together with astronaut Edgar Mitchell, organized the Institute of Noetic Sciences in 1973. Working closely with the two of them was Stanford Research Institute's Willis Harman. Paul N. Temple, who proudly professes his role in establishing the Institute of Noetic Sciences in 1973, worked per the Billy Graham Center archives with the fellowship as early as January 1944. He would have been 21 years old that year. In the last few years, he has given millions of dollars to various causes he supports through his Three Swallows Foundation. The information was culled from its 990 reports. Nearly $1.7 million since 1998 went to the International Foundation. Although one funding report gave a link to a modest Arkansas operation, searching the address on the 990 reports quickly yielded Doug Coe's Washington, D.C. address. I detailed those amounts in an article I posted several weeks ago to my own blog spot, The Harmonic Convergence of Noetic Science and Evangelicalism. That sounds interesting. That article detailed the financial aid of Paul Temple and his Three Swallows Foundation to both the Institute of Noetic Sciences and Doug Coe's Fellowship Foundation may be read by clicking here. I will leave this below, of course, so you can check these links. I am certain that many rationalized this, as some did in heated discussions I had with certain evangelical leaders about their acceptance of largesse from Reverend Moon by a belief that it's okay to take New Age monies to build the kingdom of God on earth. In my opinion, God does not need 25 cents of monies dedicated to Reverend Moon nor to the Institute of Noetic Sciences to build his kingdom. What was built was not the kingdom of God on earth, but silence sufficient to allow the final nails to be built in the long-awaited kingdom of the Antichrist. The open and obvious expectancy of the New Age forces who shamelessly avow their loyalties to Lucifer. Can you believe this? This is actually real. I know I should know this by now, but it's still crazy. How I found it. After listening to David Spangler's tape lecture of October 26, 1987, I launched through California Helpers in an effort to secure the Gold Lake Ranch tapes. Our caller was told by Gold Lake Ranch personnel that the meeting was by invitation only. She was further told that the meeting had been fully taped and each and every participant had been supplied with a full set of the tapes. When our caller expressed disappointment, the very helpful Gold Lake Ranch responder said, "Why don't you contact one of your friends who was there and duplicate their tapes?" She acted per my assistant as if it were no big deal. Good idea. We called our friends at the Spiritual Counterfeits Project. David Spangler had reported they were in his speech. The lady my research assistant spoke with promised to get information and call her back, which she did a little more than 2 hours later. She called saying, "I'm fairly new around here and don't pretend to know all the ins and outs, but something is definitely wrong. I have mailed out hundreds of tapes of anything and everything. I have never denied a request for tapes before. When I requested these tapes, they went into a closed-door meeting from which they have just now emerged and said, 'No tapes are available.' The meeting was not taped." This was obviously a lie. I placed a plea in my then newsletter, Constance Cumbey's New Age Monitor, begging for somebody to come forward. You can read about that frustrating effort, which spanned nearly a year, by clicking this link. I made a few telephone calls to Colorado contacts who reported in turn a few names of disturbed friends who were there. I compiled a database using a Microsoft card file program. As I received new information, I added same to the database. All information seemed to cease when I received a telephone call asking me to do a television debate in April 1988 against New Age writer Marilyn Ferguson. I accepted the challenge. A few minutes later, I received a telephone call from Miss Ferguson herself. She suggested we might want to consider telling our television audience all the things we agreed upon rather than our differences. I had no intention of doing that, but as long as she was calling my house in such a nice conciliatory mood, I decided to take advantage and explore any knowledge she had of the Gold Lake doings. She told me she had not received her invitation to that particular party either, but she would see what she could learn and get back to me. She called me back a few minutes later. She said she had spoken to David Spangler, who told her the meeting had been organized by evangelicals and Barbara Marks Hubbard had chaired it at the invitation of the evangelicals. Wow. It was to be several more months before I would learn of Doug Coe's purported organization of the event. I say purported because it now appears that although Doug Coe was an active participant, the event more likely was organized as part of an effort to neutralize Christian opposition to the New Age movement. It appears to have been organized by Paul Temple's daughter Robin, who noted in the invitation that Doug Coe and Barbara Marks Hubbard had agreed to co-chair the event. This was the same Paul N. Temple who was an activist with the Prayer Breakfast Network even before Doug Coe, since the days of founder Abraham Verity. It was also the same Paul N. Temple who had bought Mark Hatfield's Washington, D.C. real estate at an inflated price in 1981, leading to a Senate ethics investigation of the former Oregon governor, who went on to serve many years in the United States Senate. Next week, Part 2, Buying Evangelical Science, the Institute of Noetic Sciences and the Moonies by Christian Suppression and Silence. For Part 2, click below. Wow, maybe I'll do that one too. So this video is a continuation of a 5-part article on the New Age hijacking the evangelicals. And I also made this short little clip of a bunch of Constance Cumbey interviews and stuff, just for a real basic understanding of like what's the main goals and what the New Age is about, if in case somebody really doesn't know. And if you're not familiar with Constance Cumbey's work, she is a Christian who discovered New Age materials in her Christian bookstore and started researching the New Age way back in the 80s, and she wrote the book Hidden Dangers of the Rainbow. She's a lawyer, and she did a lot of research and came into contact with a lot of New Agers and had a lot of resistance from evangelicals. So, and in this clip that you're about to hear, she's answering the question, what is the New Age? And also, I will include a link below for her book. There's a PDF. There's a few you can find, but I will link it below, the PDF of The Hidden Dangers of the Rainbow.
Worldwide network of organizations and individuals that were dedicated to 3 overarching goals: New World Order, New World Religion, and a New Age Messiah. And there was the shared expectancy on the 3 levels. Now, she said, I'll bet the average person that drives by here doesn't know what these rainbows really mean. I'll bet they don't know what it means when they see a rainbow on a billboard or a bumper sticker. Yeah. And I'm standing right there, and I said, well, I know what they mean. And she said, what do they mean to you? And I said, same thing as a swastika. And when I said that, she froze. She utterly froze. And then she said very hopefully, what does a swastika mean to you? And I said, same thing as a rainbow. I said, they're both groups, banners for all cult groups to see, merge behind, and united in expectation of overthrowing the existing order.
And united in expectation of overthrowing the existing order.
And at that point I said to Phyllis, Phyllis, you're going to think I'm crazy. I said, but in my spare time since Barry's accident, I've become quite the Bible student. I am convinced beyond any reasonable doubt that this may very well be what was described in the Bible as the last day political social movement that would bring the Antichrist on the scene. And I was really expecting her to say, you're crazy. She didn't. She still thought I wanted to come on board. She said, oh yes, she said, that's very perceptive of you. She said, I've been convinced of that for many years myself. And I had a Bible at this stage in my stack of books, and I opened it up, and I showed her Daniel 11:38 passage. He shall honor in his estate the God of forces, a God whom his fathers knew not. And I turned to a page in the Aquarian Gospel and said, one may enter fully into the spirit of the God of forces. And she said, you saw it, you saw it. She said, that's such an important point. Most students of esotericism fail to grasp it immediately. Well, if I'd wanted to, I probably could have taken over the Theosophical Society. So you must remember that in the New Age movement and at Unity, she was a biofeedback instructor at Detroit's Unity Temple. She said, we believe Jesus and the Christ are two separate entities. The Christ is an office, not a man. Well, I quoted scripture to her, who is a liar but he that denies Jesus is the Christ. He's Antichrist that denies the Father and the Son. And suddenly, she had a mystic crystal revelation. She told me too much. And she started trying frantically to take it back. And she said, you know, Connie, it's very difficult for me to talk to you because, she said, I've received a vision of light. Now, you have to understand they had this in common, this vision of light. She said, you should pray for wisdom that God would show you the hidden meaning of these Bible passages. I said, well, I'm not a theologian. I said, but I am a lawyer. And we were taught rules of construction that seemed just as appropriate for Bible study as for legal construction, and that's ambiguities are construed against the maker of the document, and words are to be given their plain meaning. I said, I don't know about you, but I have enough faith in our Maker to believe that he would not deliberately give us an ambiguous document. She said, are you familiar with the history of the Bible and how it was written and how contradictory it is? I said, yes, I'm familiar with the history of the Bible and how it was written, but I disagree with you on the contradictory aspect. I said, tell me, Phyllis, have you read the Bible all the way through? She said, no, I've carefully avoided doing that because it might tend to confuse me. I said, would you read Homer? Would you criticize Homer without having read it? Would you criticize Shakespeare without having read it? I said, let me tell you something. I said, I did read it all the way through. I said, I didn't find all those contradictions that people speak of. I said, when I read it all the way through, I said, I found myself understanding and in full agreement.
I got to chapter 14 of the Aquarian Gospel, and it said a mighty master soul was going to come to earth, a light greater than Jesus, to light the way to the throne of perfect man. To light the way to the throne of perfect man.
I'm reading an article by Constance Cumbey. This is part 2 of The Family and its hijacking of evangelicalism. I did part 1 a few months ago. I followed it up with another article by her, which was comparing the letter after P to the Manifest Sons of God doctrine, which got me a strike. So I just laid off for a while. This is not about that letter. So I'm going to continue. This is like a 5-part series. I will leave a link to part 1 in the description. This is from 2008. Buying evangelical silence. Information sometimes comes to me in the midst of my own disorganization. I knew there had been a purported evangelization meeting between New Age leaders and evangelicals. The official line was that this was a type of missionary outreach to New Agers. Although I suspected from the beginning that deeper compromise was afoot, I would not have conclusive evidence until 2007 of the Institute of Noetic Sciences' role. It was not until 2008 that I learned of the sophisticated financial underpinnings. The Unification Church, that's the Moonies, the Unification Church seduction and purchases of much of the Christian right had been obvious many years earlier. The ION's effort, that's the Institute of Noetic Sciences, was considerably more hushed. The New Agers used to refer to the internet as the global brain. I think they forgot that God, who created the elements, matter, and our individual brains, could give us the skills to use the internet. I sometimes have quipped, did they really think we planned to communicate with tom-toms and carrier pigeons? I note wryly that Marilyn Ferguson may have been right when she wrote in her pro-New Age expository book, The Aquarian Conspiracy, that what distinguished this attempt of New Agers to spread their message was that modern communications had encircled the world beyond any possibility of retreat. But she and they forgot that it also enables us to figuratively say, the British are coming, a la Paul Revere style, with blindingly equal speed. The internet can and is used to spread truth just as, or more effectively, than New Agers use it to proselytize mysticism. My more recent discoveries came doing a chore as mundane as summertime 2007 emptying of our basement dehumidifiers. I was approaching the end of the overcluttered basement with its many shelves and stacks of books I have used as research tools over the years. I spotted Chuck Colson's 1975 book, Born Again. Remembering his involvement with Doug Coe, I absent-mindedly grabbed the book and took it to my computer room. I read portions while I was logging on to google.com. I read the following from his With Gratitude section on pages 344 through 346. Quote, 2 of the men in the fellowship, Paul Temple and Winston Weaver, made available their vacation homes in Spain and the Virginia mountains, respectively, to Patty and me when we needed a place of retreat. That was all I read. That was the only mention of Paul Temple in the book. I was, as most of my readers know, heavily focused on Javier Solana and the European Union. Javier Solana is from Spain. The thought ran through my head. I wonder if Paul Temple ever met Javier Solana. I absent-mindedly Googled as follows: Douglas Coe, Paul Temple. I was astounded to come up with this link to page after page material I wrote and others, reprinted from my former newsletter, New Age Monitor, 19 years earlier in 1988. New Age Monitor, July 1988, Constance Cumbey, Holy Watergate, The Missing 18 and 1.5 hour tapes, Gold Lake Secrecy Pact discovered in conversations with Doug Coe's secretary and Art Lindsley. Quote, a friend who also researches and writes about the New Age movement called me immediately after her July 8, 1988 conversations with Doug Coe's secretary at the Fellowship Foundation, Washington Fellowship, and Art Lindsley of the C.S. Lewis Institute about the Gold Lake event. She made extensive notes of her conversations with Dr. Gordon Lewis, Denver Seminary, Molly, Doug Coe's secretary at the Fellowship Foundation, and Dr. Art Lindsley, Spiritual Counterfeits Project, and the C.S. Lewis Institute, Washington, D.C. She shared her copious notes with me. We learned that the Gold Lake event was a retreat sponsored by Christians for New Age leaders. The events were chummy to the extent of featuring such popular trust-building exercises, popular in New Age circles, as Christians running obstacle races with New Agers. Molly told our friend that the events consisted mainly of group activities. Molly also told our friend that Art Lindsley was the person who knew about the tapes. This was the culmination of many months of our trying frustratingly to gather information on Gold Lake and being able to eke out only small tidbits from New Agers such as David Spangler and Fritz Hull bragging about the events. The following story will describe what we have been able to learn to date. Dynamic links are the newest concept in software. It appears that there are all too many dynamic links between Christians and the globalist occult community. Are they witnessing, or much more likely, are they networking? You be the judge. Barbara Marx Hubbard's most successful harmonic convergence did not take place on August 16th through 17th in 1987, nor was it the Soviet-American dialogues. Instead, her most successful blending of what she calls resonating core groups was held in Boulder, Colorado, October 24 through 26, 1987. She started at a conference called Christianity and the New Age, sponsored by Doug Coe's Fellowship Foundation, Inc., more commonly known as the Washington Fellowship or the Fellowship, the C.S. Lewis Institute, Spiritual Counterfeits Project, and other Christian organizations. The event seems to strongly smack of evangelical ministry to new religions, imprinting. In fact, many EMNR, which is evangelical ministry to new religions, many EMNR principles such as J. Vernon Grounds and Gordon Lewis were involved. Our information for this story was culled from many sources. We learned by listening to tapes of New Agers, by asking New Agers such as Marilyn Ferguson, by other Christians, calling Christians who were there and passing on the little information they received to us. The most important thing we learned was that the Christians there made a pact with the New Agers not to reveal information about their retreat. The Christians obviously kept their word better than the New Agers. In fact, the very day the conference ended, David Spangler spoke at an Episcopal church in Boulder, bragging about the success of the event. If the New Agers were less than reticent about talking about the events than the Christians, perhaps it was because the New Agers had less to hide. Exactly. Of course, the New Agers want to yoke up with Christians, but Christians don't want to be known to be yoking up with New Agers. That was me. If you didn't hear part one, please go listen to it, and I included the link to this article where David Spangler is going off about Lucifer and everything like that. So it's really awful. Another article on the same website included a copy of an invitation to the event. You may view it in context by clicking here and scrolling down as needed on the article. I will leave a link below. October 5th, 1987, name withheld, Stanford, California. Dear blankety blank. We are writing to invite you to join us for the gathering we are hosting at Gold Lake in October 24 through 27, entitled Bridging Through Christ. The conference will be held at Gold Lake Ranch, an executive retreat conference center, educational foundation, and community initiative located in the mountains outside Boulder, Colorado. We plan to meet in dialogue and prayer with our daily roles and titles. to form deep personal bonds that will last beyond this weekend. We hope to come out of this meeting with a clearer sense of direction and set a course for further contact and dialogue. The meeting will be structured so that it can change according to the needs and interests of the group. We have asked two close friends, Barbara Marks Hubbard and Doug Coe, to serve as co-hosts for this event. Okay, guys, pause. Barbara Marks Hubbard, super duper new ager, who talks about being the pale horse of death, killing off a quarter of humanity, and lots of other things. And Doug Coe, super duper Christian conservative Washington, D.C. guy. Hubbard and Doug Coe to serve as co-hosts for this event, as well as Robin's parents, Paul and Diane Temple. All of them are deeply dedicated and have each in their own way become powerful catalysts for bringing people around the globe together in the spirit of Christ. More about them is enclosed. We are planning to limit the participants to about 30 lay people in order to create the opportunity for deeper communication and sharing. We are eagerly looking forward to being with you at Gold Lake in October and getting to know you in person. Enclosed is the logistics sheet and registration form, which we would appreciate you filling out and returning it as soon as possible. Warmly, Robin and Logan Klein. Robin Klein is Paul Temple's daughter's married name. The information and its ramifications would continue to haunt me. Googling more and discovering Paul Temple's pivotal role in both the Prayer Breakfast Network and the powerful New Age Institute of Noetic Sciences disturbed me more. From time to time, I would Google Paul N. Temple and learn progressively more of his business ventures, which included a holding company named Shambhala, the mythical residence of the Tibetan masters a la Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, Helena Roerich, and Alice Ann Bailey. A few weeks ago, I made another pivotal online discovery. I did a routine search for Paul N. Temple and Googled it together with the term Noetic. This search yielded a Three Swallows Foundation. Reading online reporter summaries, I learned that recipients had included groups as diverse as Arthur Blessed Ministries, All Seasons Chalice Church, and Montessori and Steiner schools. Large amounts of money had gone to the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Much larger amounts of money had gone to something called International Foundation of Washington, D.C. International Foundation? Online Star encapsulated foundation information gave a link to an Oklahoma organization. International Foundation. Clicking on its required 990 report, this is what I found. Obviously, this modest Oklahoma missionary group could not have been the recipient of the amounts of monies indicated had been distributed by the Three Swallows Foundation. I Googled International Foundation and came up with nothing that led me to what it had really funded. I then had an idea. I went to Three Swallows Foundation 990 reports. I read the reports to the very bottom and found an entry for International Foundation. It had an address, 133 C Street, SE, Washington, D.C. I Googled that address. Bingo! Here's what I found. Mr. Douglas E. Coe, 133 C Street, Washington, D.C. Suddenly I had a much deeper understanding of why evangelical organizations I had presumed would be equally interested in knowledge of New Age hostile ones had so frantically tried to stop my work. The motive was in no small part money, but Paul N. Temple and perhaps others was funding both sides, New Age and Christian. Totaling Paul Temple's Three Swallows Foundation donations as shown in its 990 forms between 1998 in 2007, I would learn that nearly 1.7 million had been donated to the International Foundation and various smaller amounts to groups as diverse as Arthur Blessed Ministries and Campus Crusade for Christ. Nearly $700,000 had gone to his own Institute of Noetic Sciences. The Gold Lake Conference had been convened by Paul Temple's own children, clearly not to bridge to Jesus Christ, but to bridge to their New Age Christ. Silence has been purchased at no small cost in dollars to Paul N. Temple and in souls lost to evangelicals. Legitimate opposition to the hostile anti-Christian New Age movement had been marginalized to protect Paul Temple's investment. Those not bought off by Paul Temple were bought off with even greater investments from the Moonies. For part 1, click below. Next week, part 3, Unification Church, a seduction and corruption of Christian theology. Oh. My mind is blown. Why should it be? You combine this and the CNP, did a video about that a little while ago. I'm not the biggest expert, but when you start looking into this and you see this network and how much Christians and New Age are been blending together in political and all these different ways, it's really no wonder what we're seeing in the church today.
I've got the good news and the bad news. The bad news is that really basically the New Age movement is the worship of Lucifer, the one who fell from heaven. We're told about him in Isaiah. He said, I will be as the Most High God. And in saying that, he was cast down from his position as a beautiful being, as an angel of light, and as someone who was a worshipper himself. And when he made that statement, God had to remove him from his position in heaven. The New Age movement, in this worship of Lucifer, embodies within itself, I will be as the Most High God. That's really the philosophy that's in there that says, I am God is.
Run.
Constance Cumbey had direct contact with Benjamin Creme face-to-face in Detroit, Michigan. I had the opportunity to meet this brave woman, and she showed me the place in which she had attended a lecture by Benjamin Creme.
Spoke to a packed crowd November 4th, 1981, and Bread for the World was out there, had tables, Oxfam, every group you could think of was sitting out there. They were passing out brochures. The brochure is reproduced in both of my books. Benjamin Creme came in. He gave some kind of a hand signal that looked something like that, and I thought at first he was waving to somebody, but the crowd appeared to flip into a trance. And then he started speaking, and he was rotating his head. I can't even come close to, it was as close to a 180-degree spin of a head as I've ever seen. How his head didn't snap off, I'll never know. And then he started talking and laying out what they were doing, and the crowd was thoroughly under several degrees of hypnosis. I knew many people in that crowd from political circles and social circles in Detroit for many years, and I talked to some of them, and the common denominator was they had all been through one kind of mind control course or another, one type of New Age class or another. I talked to a fellow behind me, Al Banks, and I said, he was a film producer doing much of what you're doing now. And I said, Al, I know what I'm doing here tonight. What are you doing here? And he said, because, Connie, he said, I'm taking a course in miracles at Unity. He said, I've joined Unity. We're all required to take a spiritual growth class. I've taken a course in miracles. It was a class requirement that we be here tonight. And then he said, you know, Connie, I would have thought a progressive person like you would have joined Unity a long time ago. Well, then I started explaining to him exactly why I haven't. And he, like, snapped, the glaze snapped off his eyes for a little bit. He thanked me for telling him. And then Creme came in and started doing his thing. And at the end of the evening, they had been promised an appearance by Maitreya, the Christ, channeled through Benjamin Creme himself, that Maitreya would speak through Benjamin Creme. And Benjamin Creme asked everybody to join in the recitation of the Great Invocation. I told the woman standing next to me, I will not say the Great Invocation with you. I will say my own prayer. And she was a nice little prim, proper looking black lady. Could have been active in any Black Baptist church in Detroit from her appearance. And she said, no, that's all right, honey. We all have our own paths to God. I said, the reason I will not say the Great Invocation with you, the scriptures clearly said that the Antichrist would come denying that Jesus was the Christ. I said, Benjamin Creme has denied it all evening and said Jesus was not the Christ and this Maitreya was. And the woman said what Benjamin Creme had said. She said, there's been many Christs. I said, there's been one, and his name is Jesus. And people turned from rows around and looked at me like I was crazy. And so then Benjamin Creme came in and he started the nearly close to 180 degree spin of his neck again. And the crowd's hypnotic trance appeared to deepen, and he started out from the point of light within the mind of God, may light spring forth ever. And I went nice and clear, and I'll tell you, the acoustics in that building are wonderful. I said, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And I did that each and every stanza. And they got down to the last part, said, may light and love and power fulfill the plan on earth, and may it seal the door where evil dwells. And I said nice and loud and clear, I said, may Jesus Christ return to earth and end the evil present in this room tonight. Well, the funniest thing happened, or may I say it did not happen. Benjamin Creme stood there. He waited, and he waited. He clearly was watching for something to come over him. And it didn't happen. And he finally said to the crowd, he said, that will be all. You are dismissed. And, of course, everybody was extremely disappointed. And we went to the door and I went walking out. I had brought some co-spies with me. They were kind of chickening out at that point and waiting for me. They were afraid of being ripped limb to limb. And I stood down there, and a number of those people knew me, and they were just furious with me. And I stood there calm, cool, and collected, and I said, well, I said, if you're Maitreya the Christ, Betreya the Christ, or whatever his name's supposed to be, or everything he's cracked up to be, one lousy Christian in there saying the Lord's Prayer shouldn't have stopped him.
I'm reading part 3 of The Family and Its Hijacking of Evangelicalism by attorney Constance Cumbey from 2008. How it all started for me. Traipsing around Wayne State University in the late 1960s when I was a student, I saw posters for a new Messiah, Sun Myung Moon. I thought then of the biblical warnings of Jesus that false Christs and Messiahs shall rise, deceiving many. Reverend Moon was visiting the United States then. He moved here in the 1970s. The followers elicited many jokes about flower sellers. Books by authors such as Ted Patrick warned that these groups were brainwashing America's children. The only seeming Christian regard for them then appeared to be that of something to be avoided at all costs. I graduated from law school in 1975 and immediately began an active practice. My work frequently took me downtown. Downtown Detroit had a prominent building still there, the First National Building. The First National building had a health food bar, where somebody could sip herbal teas, buy ginseng tablets, billed as a legal way to keep us awake, and eat various nutritional goodies. Although the staff was fairly quiet, it soon came out that they believed Reverend Moon was the Messiah. When Benjamin Creme spoke in Detroit November 4th, 1981, the Unification health food store and faces commonly seen there were included in this large audience. So was just about every other mind control and or other forms of New Age. Bread for the World and Oxfam also had a presence that evening. The First National Health Food Bar personnel were visibly present. There were so many people in the audience representing such a huge variety of New Age groups, ranging from the Est to Rajneesh Oso to Unity and A Course in Miracles, that Unification Church seemed to be the least of our worries. When I collected the New Age books and periodicals, there was ample evidence that Reverend Moon and his organization were clearly part of the New Age landscape. Escalating events seemed to carry me about after Benjamin Creme and the company ran their April 25, 1982 advertisement proclaiming the Christ is now here. Only a few short days after those ads appeared, the local paper, the Detroit Free Press, featured a large feature article by staff writer Ruth Seymour. The numbers attending my local lecture suddenly jumped from 35 to hundreds. I was suddenly on demand for television appearances, radio interviews, and many out-of-town lectures. I would put my law practice on hold for the next 7 years and get the bulk of my exercise running for planes. An unexpected referral fee for an old medical malpractice fee came just in time to sustain us financially during this time that my law income was diminished. As I did not feel I could maintain credibility for a controversial message by exploiting it financially, I spoke for free will offerings. Often the speaking engagements came from small churches that sacrificed to raise the transportation and lodging expenses. To lighten the load on organizers, more often than not, I was housed in church member homes. Things were happening to me so rapidly I could scarcely reflect on them, let alone daily catalog them. This was also a time when I was receiving fierce opposition from too many evangelical sources for reasons I did not understand and would not fully understand until I discovered the details outlined in the first 2 articles of this series. It was a time of tremendous anxiety and stress for both me and my family. My disabled husband, who had lost both legs above the knees in a 1979 accident, and my son were understanding troopers throughout these years, as I traveled more heavily than I had expected to ever do in my life. The Hidden Dangers of the Rainbow was released in May 1983. By early October 1983, it headed the Christian bestseller list for the USA. Foreign editions were scheduled. It was about that time I received a letter which rang a curious bell. The letter on a Kaza letterhead. In case you don't know what Kaza is, it's an arm of the Reverend Sun Myung Moon's Unification Church, a group called Kaza, or Cause in Spanish. It's pumping millions of dollars into anti-communist organizing effort throughout the United States and in much of Central and South America. I just wanted you to know what Kaza is, and also everything that's anti-communist isn't necessarily good. Just saying. Was signed by U.S. Brigadier General E.D. Woolner. It invited me to an all-expenses-paid seminar in Washington, D.C. to explore positive alternatives to Marxism. It specifically denied any Unification Church involvement in its operation. I pulled an article from my filing cabinet I had recently filed under Uruguay. The article talked about the success of the Unification Church in that South American country. It further called Kaza the political arm of the Unification Church. Just about that time, the phone rang and Kansas City friends were on the line. They told me they had just come back from a Kaza conference and were shocked at what they had seen. They said all accommodations were deluxe. They said they had met a Bohi Pak, whom they subsequently learned was the number 2 in Unification Church. Cleon Skousen, as well as W. Stewart McBride, author of then popular books on the Antichrist, had been present at the same conference. My Kansas City friends told me they said to each other, "Good grief, they're presenting the entire New Age agenda as a positive alternative to Marxism." Reminds me of, what's that thing called? Reawaken America, maybe? There was a form to fill out at the end of this conference. It included a "Whom shall we invite?" They duly filled out Constance Cumbey, complete with Detroit address and phone number. They called me to say that they both thought it terribly important that I see it for myself. They were right. Shortly thereafter, I got a follow-up call from CASA staff. I said I would accept their invitation. However, they would have to fly me from Fort Wayne, Indiana, as I would be there for Christmas. They would have to return me to Detroit. The terms were accepted. Flying that milk bucket route, I was routed through Charlotte and got there several hours late. There was a car lot with the CASA sign held aloft waiting for me. She drove me to the hotel. I went to the room, which I learned was to be shared with a female author of books on camping. She told me she was there because they had a son involved in Unification Church. They had tried unsuccessful attempts at deprogramming, and they had given up on seeing their son again. Then she said, out of the blue, they were contacted by Unification Church personnel and told that if they became active in CASA, they could have free access to their son. I filed this using of children as literal hostages to the devil away in my memory for future reference. I then went down to the reception, which was full of almost every delicacy one could conceive. It was there that I met Kofi Annan, who would later become Secretary General of the United Nations. He must have told the organizers that I had expressed concerns, as shortly thereafter I was taken aside and grilled by General and Mrs. E.D. Woolner. They said, "Who invited you?" I said, "You did." I was to be watched extremely closely over the next few hours until I was literally put under house arrest and extradited back to Detroit. It was, to make a long story very short, quite an experience. What was even more shocking was to watch the Christians sitting there very respectfully under the image of Buddha projected during the presentations, and hearing that when we say God, we mean the God who is the God of the Christians, of the Jews, of the Mormons, of Unification Church. Well, I had the conference materials and list of names of those there. I also had a sense of the danger the organization posed. CASA Executive Director Joseph Tully had admitted to me, "Yes, we work with Benjamin Creme and Tara Center, but we don't all agree on who that new Christ is." For the record, I had not mentioned Tara Center to him, only that I had seen local unificationists in the Detroit area present at the November 1981 Creme lecture. I returned home. Many radio interviews gave me the opportunity to give CASA more free advertising than they had ever counted on. I had telephone calls from Memphis pastors, 2 saying they were from large Memphis, Tennessee churches, called to tell me the unificationists had tried to work their congregations over religious freedom issues. They said they're working to free people such as Everett Sullivan and Reverend Moon from religious persecution. These godly men further told me that they were presented brochures indicating bubblegum card Christians such as Tim LaHaye, chairman, Marlon Madow, Jan and Paul Crouch, and many others were named on the brochure for the organization, Coalition for Religious Freedom. The minister said they had called these people who had refused to listen. Given my recent personal experience with this cult, I listened. We would move to Lake Orion, Michigan in late 1984. In late 1985, I read an article, The Moonies and the Christian Right, by freelance writer Carolyn Weaver in Mother Jones magazine. I saw it in the small bookstore of Lake Orion, where we were very new in town. Ms. Weaver said that by writing this article, which featured sad news of Tim LaHaye's entanglement with Bohi Pak, she did not intend to imply that the average fundamentalist Christian supported Bohi Pak or Unification Church in any manner. To the contrary, the average Christian would perceive Bohi Pak as an altar boy to the Antichrist, aptly wrote Ms. Weaver. At Huntington House's request, I attended the 1986 National Religious Broadcasters Convention held in Washington, D.C. in February 1984. 2 years earlier, Tim LaHaye had introduced himself to me. We had a cordial discussion. He told me the threat, as he saw it, was secular humanism. I told him I thought he should take a closer look at the New Age movement. I did not stay at the hotel, but with Washington area friends in 1986. I'm certain that Tim LaHaye, who then lived in Washington, D.C., was not staying at the hotel either. I was scheduled to leave for Colorado for speaking engagements in Colorado Springs and Denver. I wanted to speak with Tim LaHaye personally about Ms. Weaver's allegations. As I was coming down a Sheraton Hotel elevator, Tim LaHaye was coming up. I said, "Tim," and he looked over. "Constance Cumbey." I said, "Oh yes, we'll get together," he said. It never happened, and it was probably nobody's fault. I was scheduled to speak to an Eagle Forum conference in Colorado Springs. My assigned topic was New Age infiltration of the church. I was wishing I had that article with me, but I did not. The Eagle Forum chairman for Colorado, Jane Schindler, however, brought me a copy and specifically asked me to comment on it. I mentioned only in passing that it was one more example of how New Age factions are seeking to neutralize and even proselytize the church. Another speaker was Peter Waldron, also of Washington, D.C. Over the past 4 years, I have done many radio interviews with him. He and Tim LaHaye had joint radio ventures in Washington, D.C. It was a bright post-snowy day in Colorado Springs when the sponsoring committee took me to lunch at First Cafeteria. We were all startled to hear paging Wanda Leonard over the cafeteria speaker system. Wanda left for the page and came back signaling me. "Tim LaHaye is on the phone," she said. She told me he said, "This is the Reverend Tim LaHaye calling from Washington, D.C. She said, "Yes," and he then said, "I understand you had a certain speaker named Constance Cumbey speak at your conference." She said, "Yes." He then said, "I understand she quoted from a sleazy left-wing magazine, referring to Mother Jones." Wanda said, "Well, Tim, Constance is here. I think you should speak with her yourself." He said, "Fine, put her on." I said, "Wanda, I'm not about to debate with Tim LaHaye on First Cafeteria only phone located at their cash register at the height of their rush hour, especially when my own lunch is getting cold. He'll have to call me later." Wanda scheduled me for a 3:30 Colorado time telephone conference with Tim LaHaye. Next week, Part 4, the LaHaye Conversation, Me as the New Enemy and the Continued Incursions of Unification Church into Jerry Falwell's Networks and Beyond. Burying the Cross with Reverend Moon.
New Age movement in this worship of Lucifer embodies within itself, I will be as the Most High God. That's really the philosophy that's in there that says, I am, God is.
What do they teach? Who you are requires no belief. Heaven is not a location, but refers to the inner realm of consciousness. The man on the cross is an archetypal image. He is every man and every woman. The leader's website teaches these lessons. My mind is part of God's. I am very holy. My holiness is my salvation. My salvation comes from me. Let me remember that there is no sin. Do not make the pathetic error of, quote, clinging to the old rugged cross, unquote. The only message of the crucifixion is that you can overcome the cross.
The New Age Commandments. Good and evil are one. All is interrelated. You are interdependent. No difference between God, a rock, a cabbage, a person. No divisions, no boundaries, only frequencies. No absolutes, but one continuous reality. You are all gods. You have lived before and will live again. There is no death. We create our own reality, destiny, existence.
I didn't understand fully what I was looking at until I found a book by a California writer named Marilyn Ferguson called The Aquarian Conspiracy, Personal and Social Change in the 1980s. And all the things I found disturbing, she found encouraging. She said, now the heretics are gaining ground. Doctrine is losing its authority. And knowing is superseding belief. And she quoted from a book called The Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ. And for some reason, when I read the quote, I thought it was terribly important that I find that book, and I did track it down the very next day at the Methodist bookstore, I'm sorry to say. And Dixon Bible and Books, which was owned by a member of my own church, I'm sorry to say, had copies of the book in stock as well. And it was basically written in King James style English. And this was about Jesus, obviously the jet setter. He wasn't hanging around Palestine. He was traveling to India and China. And the Aquarian masters sitting in council had told us that Jesus was not always the Christ, that just as Jesus had earned the degree Christ by a life of strenuous service and equipping himself to find the Christ consciousness, that Jesus wasn't always, just as Lincoln was not always president, Edward was not always king, neither was Jesus always the Christ. He had earned the degree Christ by these certain practices. And they had John the Baptist was also out seeking wisdom, and he also had pagan masters. And John the Baptist one day asked his pagan masters, per this version, the Aquarian Gospel, he said, why do we need any further illumination? These teachings, the Vedas, the Upanishads, these are so sublime, so perfect. And his master explained to him, he said, in the past when man needed illumination and progress to advance to a further point, the masters would send somebody. Said, but now the ages have passed, and he said, in their proper place, the Hebrew Psalms and Bible, the Hebrew Psalms and Proverbs were given for man's enlightenment. Said, but now that age is past, and it is time for more revelation, and Jesus is the flesh-made messenger to bring that light to man. But in the ages yet to come, man will attain to greater lights, and greater lights will be needed and sent. And I wrote in my margin a neat trick. I said, and finally at last, a mighty master soul will arise to light the way to the throne of perfect man. I slammed that book shut. I was spastic. I knew I just looked at something about and promoting and preparing folks for the Antichrist.
Reading part 4 of The Family and Its Hijacking of Evangelicalism by Constance Cumbey. In part 3, I told of my personal experiences witnessing a CASA conference. It purported to be an alternative to Marxism, non-Unification Church event. However, it was obviously operated and controlled by Unification Church, and nearly all speakers praised Reverend Moon and Unification Church. When its organizers discovered they had invited an enemy, they took steps to immediately isolate and deport me back to Detroit. 2 years later, I had an unexpected encounter with Tim LaHaye on the subject. It was February 7th, 1986. I left Washington, D.C. for speaking engagements in Colorado Springs. I did not see Tim LaHaye again while in Washington. I was scheduled to speak in Monument, Colorado, and thereafter for a Colorado Eagle Forum Friday-Saturday conference. From there, I was taken to Denver for a busy and intense schedule that would span the next 2 weeks. Monday, February 10th, I was taken by the committee to Furr's cafeteria. We obtained our food and had just seated. Suddenly we heard, "Paging Wanda Leonard, paging Wanda Leonard." We were fearful that there was an emergency with her husband and or children. Wanda answered the page. She then summoned me and said, "Tim LaHaye is on the phone." He said, "This is the Reverend Tim LaHaye calling from Washington, D.C." She said, "Yes." He said, "I understand you had a certain woman named Constance Cumbey speak at your conference." Wanda said, "Yes." He then said, "I understand she quoted from a sleazy left-wing magazine." Wanda said, "Well, Tim, Constance is here. I think you should speak with her yourself." "Fine, put her on," said Tim LaHaye. I told Wanda I am not about to debate with Tim LaHaye on First Cafeteria's only phone located by their cash register at the height of their rush hour, especially when my own lunch is getting cold. He'll have to call me later. After lunch, I had a cordial meeting with the pastor of a large Presbyterian church in Colorado Springs. Then we hurried to Wanda Leonard's house for the 3:30 telephone conference she had scheduled between Dr. LaHaye and myself. The phone rang. Wanda answered it and then handed it to me. Tim LaHaye started by apologizing for not getting back to me in Washington, D.C. the week before. Then he abruptly said, "You said that I was part of the New Age movement." I was startled. "I said no such thing," I replied. He next said, "Well, you quoted from a sleazy left-wing magazine." He was obviously referring to Carolyn Weaver's important article, "The Moonies and the Christian Right," that had recently appeared in Mother Jones magazine. I said, "Well, Tim, was it true?" He repeated, "It's a sleazy left-wing magazine." I said, "Tim, I don't care if it was the Moscow Journal. Was it true? Did she make it all up?" He did not answer. I then told him of the experience I had with the Unification Church group CASA and the admission they had made to me, combined with the clear pronouncement that Reverend Moon was the Lord of the Second Advent. He didn't want to hear, but I finished the story. I then said, "Tim, there were clear biblical warnings about going to Egypt for help against Assyria." "I never went to Egypt," said Tim LaHaye. "No, you went to Reverend Moon and Bohe Pak. That's even worse." I told Tim LaHaye that in my opinion, God did not need 25 cents worth of Unification Church money to build his kingdom. I was amazed at what Tim LaHaye said next. He said, "I never took any money from Bohe Pak or Unification Church." "Oh?" I replied. He said the liberal-controlled Washington Post refused to give ACTV, American Coalition for Traditional Values, any publicity. So I contacted Bohe Pak, who arranged for a series of stories to appear in the Washington Times. I was writing to thank him for those stories. I said, "Tim, would you seriously like that explanation presented to a jury?" He was silent. I note for the record that the context of the letter was clearly financial. Moreover, it appeared to be priming the pump for more Unification Church contributions. I said, "Tim, if you only knew how many people have contacted me about their churches being ruined because their ministers accepted invitations for Korean trips and came back changed." "I knew that was happening," said Tim LaHaye. "That's why I resigned from Coalition for Religious Freedom." "Yes, but you didn't resign from ACTV. You didn't resign from Family Life Seminars," I replied. Then he said that he had been involved in Coalition for Religious Freedom for religious liberty issues. I told him that it was my understanding that Reverend Moon's prosecution had nothing to do with religious liberty issues whatsoever. It was a tax fraud case, pure and simple. Reverend Moon had produced some allegedly 15-year-old affidavits to prove that he had been holding property in trust from Unification Church members. The IRS had done their standard watermark testing and discovered that the documents were very new ones. Tim then said, "Look, we're both on the same side. You call it the New Age movement, I call it secular humanism. It's the same thing." I said, "Well, Tim, I have an idea. Since we both agree that Unification Church is bad, and we both agree that they have been using your name unfairly to their advantage, why don't you publicly denounce them? That way, they won't be able to use your name to advantage anymore." Tim LaHaye literally snarled, "I'll be the judge of that." Then he slammed the telephone down without saying goodbye. I never spoke to him again. A few weeks later, I was speaking in the Seattle area. Angie Schiermeyer, my West Coast coordinator, answered a ringing telephone. On the other end was a Washington Concern for Women of America coordinator. She told Angie she had just returned from a CWA leadership conference held, as I recall, in Houston. All 50 state coordinators were there. She said Beverly LaHaye instructed them that nobody should give Constance Cumbey a platform. When they questioned why, she reportedly said that I had called the LaHayes New Agers in my latest book. None of my books have ever mentioned the LaHayes. And I had attacked a dear friend of theirs, referring to Pat Robertson, who I critiqued for, among other things, promoting Jeremy Rifkin's New Age agenda and telling his viewers that when the Bible said, "Every eye shall behold him," it meant on television. I, Constance Cumbey, was the new enemy. Per Angie, the coordinator said that until Beverly LaHaye had given her directive, they didn't even know my second book was out. Several of them had immediately thereafter rushed to local bookstores to buy it. Encouragingly, however, over the years, some courageously resisted Unification Church lures and pressures. A Minnesota conservative activist, James Racer, was moved to write a pamphlet warning about the dangers of networking with Unification Church. He was urged to silence, as I so often was, by those who said he would damage the conservative cause by speaking. Here's what Racer so cogently presented. Many conservatives would rather not have this information made public, fearing that it will damage the movement. I suggest that no one needs to fear the truth. If the conservative movement is based on fraud and deception, which it would be if this truth is stifled, then it deserves to be damaged. Moon has, in the AFC, a tremendous vehicle to assist his political movements in the USA. Combining the thousands of black church leaders trained through various Moon-linked organizations with the newfound political power and savvy of the so-called new right Christian activists, many who would be attracted to Christian voice would have a profound impact on America and the world. What Moon adds to this political formula, which has been missing in almost all concentrated conservative organizing efforts, is millions of dollars and hundreds of committed volunteers. The true believers and followers of Moon, regardless of what Dr. Robert Grant, Bob Wilson, Richard Icord, Dr. Ralph Abernathy, Richard Vigueri, Gary Jarman, Dan Peterson, or any of the other hundreds of officers and leaders involved in the AFC, believe the documentation I received after my resignation provided to me that the Reverend Sun Myung Moon has a plan for America, and his plan includes the American Freedom Coalition. Equally disturbing as Tim LaHaye's apparent compromise was Jerry Falwell's. Jerry Falwell would speak at the 1997 CASA program 4 years after my own encounter as a keynote speaker for CASA. If he ever uttered a word against the New Age movement, I never heard of it. Perhaps others did. Again, the lure for him was obviously money. Moon had reportedly bailed his university out of a financial crisis. What could have been persuasive voices against religious apostasy and the New Age movement, including one of its more odious expressions in the form of Reverend Moon, who claimed to be the Lord of the Second Advent, had been either muted or silenced. Next week, part 5 of this expanding series will include the 12 involved with Abraham Verity and Marian Johnson in the formative years of Fellowship Foundation. Included in the discussion will be Frank Laubach, Norman Grubb, Glenn Clark of Camps Farthest Out. Was it Christianity or was it badly disguised theosophy? The influence of Frank Buckman and MRA.
These are some egregious, satanic, luciferic, evil things we're going to be talking about that strike at the very core of biblical Christianity. These aren't trivial issues. These aren't just things that you can say, well, we'll just pass it by and no big deal. Not that way at all. These are major, major heresies, blasphemies, doctrinal issues, and a lot of these issues even cross over into literally a matter of salvation, of going to either heaven or hell. So it's not something that when you see this stuff that you should take lightly. So going further, let's see here. Example, Tim LaHaye said this to Sun Myung Moon 20 years before Moon claimed to be the Messiah. Now, Sun Myung Moon, and I've done a study on him, and I give you the teaching on that, claims to be the Messiah on planet Earth. And we're going to go over all that information again. It's been a long time since I did that study. And you're not going to believe how many people are yoked up with this guy, this gigantic cult leader. You're not going to believe how many Bible-believing, supposed born-again Christians are yoked up with this devil. Okay? Tim LaHaye, the author of the Left Behind series, okay, said this to Sun Myung Moon 20 years before Moon claimed to be the Messiah. Before Sun Myung Moon gave Jerry Falwell $3.5 million for his Regent University.
He bailed out what became Liberty University. Okay? Moon bailed that out.
And we're going to get to that too. Before Jerry Falwell hired and exposed liar Ergen Kaner, we're going to talk about him more, before Chuck Missler placed LaHaye on his Board of Regents. And again, all these are little issues that we will get to in totality later in the study. Tim LaHaye said of Moon, quote, "Your suffering will cleanse the sins of America." End of quote.
This is his Moon's suffering for being locked up due to tax fraud charges by the IRS. Okay? His suffering, this false teacher and false prophet of where he was, there's money laundering going on with the Moonies and allegations of gun rugging and human trafficking and lots of stuff. It's been covered. Oh, you can go research it for yourself. They're involved in a lot of mafioso type things around the world. Okay, more than just spreading false, heretical, different gospel with the Unification Church. Okay, but Tim LaHaye said it's the suffering and the blood of Moon that will cleanse the United States of America. Tim LaHaye's a heretic. He's a heretic. Left Behind's heretical. And Jerry B. Jenkins is a heretic. His son Dallas Jenkins is pushing Mormonism on The Chosen. Okay? Gotta have strong discernment, you guys.
When he was in prison for a time here. And again, we're going to get to that very soon. And this is all referenced, the stuff that we're talking about here. There's a teaching that I did on this previously that I just mentioned, and it's entitled Reverend Falwell, Reverend Sun Myung Moon, and the Love of Money. And this is from 2007, May 20th, 2007. So it's been quite a while. Now, there's a link here. You can click on that. The audio quality on my earlier teachings aren't what it is today. I was still trying to figure out more of the sound things, and I went through a lot of sound configurations. Not to say it's perfect today, but it's a lot better than it was. But anyway, I'm just going to give you the actual description of this teaching. In this teaching, we will be looking at the fruit of some of the most prominent Christian figures in America. This list will include Jerry Falwell Sr. And Jr., Timothy LaHaye of the Left Behind series, Gary Bauer, Bill Bright, Paul Crouch, Dr. James Dobson, Billy Graham, Dr. D. James Kennedy,
James Dobson, CMP, D. James Kennedy, CMP,
Billy LaHaye, Ralph Reed, Pat Robertson,
CMP, Pat Robertson, CMP,
Robinson, Phyllis Schlafly,
CMP,
George Bush Sr. and Jr., and
CMP.
Dr. Robert Schuller. Jesus said, "By their fruits ye shall know them," which is in reference to the fruit of a true Christian as opposed to a pseudo-Christian tare, like the tares, the wheat and the tares in the Bible. We will be looking at the undeniable, documented financial links of the people listed above to the cult leader, Reverend Sun Myung Moon of the Unification Church in Korea. Unbelievably, good old Reverend Moon was actually crowned Messiah and Savior of the earth. I'm not making this up. He was crowned Messiah and Savior of the earth on March 23rd, 2004 at the Dirksen Senate Office building in Washington,
Yeah, by our United States Congress. By our United States Congress. That is 100% true. When we go over to the Unification Church, you will see those photos.
Now, if you don't believe that, click on the study, and you can click on the PDF. This devil was literally crowned Messiah and Savior on planet Earth, March 23rd, 2004, at the Dirksen Senate Office in Washington, D.C., where scores of, quote, Christian leaders, as well as several U.S. senators and representatives, met for this very blasphemous occasion. Southern Baptist leaders were on hand as well, as were Trinity Broadcasting Network President Paul Crouch. We're going to talk a lot about good old Paul.
Good old Paul Crouch, CMP.
Reverend Jerry Falwell, Reverend Robert Schuller. And again, I've done a whole teaching on the title of Reverend, which is totally unbiblical for a human to take. It's only used one time in the Bible where it's in description of God, and it says holy and reverend is he. If you want to hear that teaching, just key in Reverend in the search box at contendingfortruth.com, and you'll find it. It's only like 20 minutes long, I think. Also in attendance were Kenneth Copeland, Pat Boone, and many others. Moon claims...
Pat Boone, the famous comedian and actor. CMP.
This devil claims Jesus failed on his mission to earth, but Moon has not failed. This is one of the largest smoking guns and flagrant moves ever made and condoned by mainstream Christian figures and politicians. This information is based on highly referenced factual evidence. We even give you the pictures, even in this study, of the actual proclamation from that night from this Dirksen Senate. I mean, we show you the pictures of the guy getting crowned. I mean, they're putting this crown on this devil. And he's wearing, I mean, it's incomprehensible. But this isn't something I've talked about a lot in, this has been like 5 years almost since I did this study. But it heavily relates to this teaching we're doing today. And when you start to get a grasp, I like this study because you really get a grasp of the totality of the sheer vastness of this apostasy, of the infiltration of the so-called Christian corporate church in America. It is mind-blowing, this information.
That the Unification Church, established in 1954, it wasn't established as a religious organization. It was, to my thinking, based upon all of my research, I truly believe that it was a pseudo-religious, or maybe more appropriately put, a socio-political organization with a religious facade.
Exactly.
And that's exactly how it started.
Yeah.
Back then.
Yeah.
We see these signs.
That's what I came to when I read the entire House subcommittee investigation, and I read the founder of the Korean CIA's testimony under oath that he organized and utilized the Unification Church for use as a political tool, and just learned. I was like, oh, this was a psyop. Oh, this was to counter North Korean brainwashing, to brainwash South Koreans, but use a front group with a pseudo-religious facade as a cover, so it wouldn't look like this Korean government or the American intelligence people. So we both arrived at the same conclusion, it sounds like.
I think a good moment for me to mention about the far right. Some people have called it the radical religious right, dominionism, reconstructionism. That what's happening here is we have some very powerful people in government that have aligned themselves with something that is called Christianity, but as you and I both know, has nothing to do with Jesus's heart, or however you want to phrase that.
Right. I wrote about it in The Cult of Trump, that basically they think they have to take over governments, take over, culture and science, and end the separation of church and state, and create a theocracy to run the world for God.
Yeah.
Except it's humans that are claiming that. You should write a book. There's a book that needs to get written about what this cult really is about, and like outing all of the neo-Nazis, the libertarians, the dominionists, as you said, the ones that say Jesus lied when he said my kingdom is not of this world. Jesus wants us to take over the government and have lots of money to run things.
Right.
Run.
Hi guys. I just wanted to say that I'm old enough to remember this. And in case you're new to my channel, I want you to understand something, that I'm not promoting this person or agreeing, except on this point, she might be right. And what I have found is that what we thought was on our side might not be. In fact, I think they might be worse, because you don't see it coming.
The great story here, for anybody willing to find it and write about it and explain it, is this vast right-wing conspiracy that
worldwide network of organizations and individuals that were dedicated to three overarching goals: New World Order, New World Religion, and a New Age Messiah. And
is this vast right-wing conspiracy that
there was the shared expectancy on the three levels.
Is this vast right-wing conspiracy that
so they're both groups, banners for all cult groups to see, merge behind, and united in an expectation of overthrowing the existing order.
Is this vast right-wing conspiracy that
and united in an expectation of overthrowing the existing order.
Is this vast right-wing conspiracy that
and united in an expectation of overthrowing the existing order.
is this vast right-wing conspiracy, the right-wing conspiracy.
Part 5 of The Family and Its Hijacking of Evangelicalism by Constance Cumbey. Author's notes. This was originally to be a 4-part series. Parts 1, 2 dealt with modern merging and blending of Washington's Fellowship Foundation and Paul N. Temple's Institute of Noetic Sciences. Barbara Marx Hubbard said in her 1988 Seattle Unity Temple speech that now all the resonating core groups with outwardly different purposes are merging and blending and coming together to do the one work. Okay, so what that sounds like to me is outwardly different purposes, like Christians and New Agers coming together to do the one work, the one world, the one religion. It was clear that she was working closely with both Paul Temple and the Fellowship Foundation, both groups of which she had and continues to successfully bridge.
Is this vast right-wing conspiracy that...
This is an older article. Barbara Marx Hubbard died. The problems, however, are much older. They are clearly multi-generational. According to the Billy Graham Center archives, Paul Temple's own involvement with Abraham Verity dated back to 1944. pause again. I'm going to pause a lot in this article. 1944. This is during the time that Alice Bailey was alive, and she was writing about how the New Age movement was going to come through the church. Okay? So it already had started while she was still alive. That's my opinion. Meetings of the group, which included clear proponents of We Are Gods, Frank Laubach, date back earlier to 1943 and perhaps even earlier. Developing the series, I now know subject is clearly too vast to be easily synopsized in only 4 relatively short articles that the News with Views editor and I originally discussed. I was going to focus solely on the work of the 12, this article, but in the drafting process realized that to understand these 12, one had to understand developments that preceded them, starting with Madame Blavatsky's pre-death pronouncement that they were to prepare the world to receive a new Christ. Clear preparation went forth in a deliberate manner. Only God knows the intensity, motivations, and commitment of those intentionally or inadvertently helping to implement the theosophical agenda. But an agenda there clearly was, and clearly there were professed Christians helping, even from the beginning, who should have known better, particularly considering their claimed levels of theological sophistication.
Is this vast right-wing conspiracy.
Early theosophical planning. Madame Blavatsky, Colonel Olcott, and William L. Q. Judge organized their Theosophical Society in New York City in the year of our Lord, 1875. The first of this trio was a Russian expatriate adventuress. The 2 gentlemen were American lawyers. Olcott was reportedly a Civil War hero who had played a leading role in the investigation of the Lincoln murders. The purpose of the society was supposedly to study comparative religions. The occult, hidden purpose was much deeper. Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky revealed to her followers before what that purpose was, to prepare the world to receive a new expected Messiah by the name of Maitreya. Maitreya was also the name the Buddhists gave to their expected reincarnation of Buddha. Annie Besant, the ex-wife of an Anglican clergyman, took Blavatsky's charge very seriously. So Annie Besant was the ex-wife of a clergyman, and Alice Bailey was also, I think, the widow of a clergyman. Her husband was a minister before she became Alice Bailey. She led the first annual Congress of the Federation of European Sections of the Theosophical Society. It was held in Amsterdam from June 19th through the 21st of 1904. I am fortunate to own an original edition of its published proceedings. Federation of European Sections of the Theosophical Society. Transactions, First Annual Congress, Amsterdam, 1906. I have had the book, which I purchased back in the 1980s for the even then outrageous price of $95. It was marked rare. It is an indispensable volume in my research library. Some names at that conference are still easily recognizable today. Annie Besant, Rudolf Steiner, Wardolf Steiner Schools, Eurythmy, Biodynamic Farming, A.R. Orridge, Social Credit, The New Age, were among the more prominent in attendance whose recognition has survived through modern history. The 2 most significant articles from my perspective are the papers presented to that Congress by a name less known to us, but obviously from its fruits productive to the Theosophical movement, I. Hooper. Hooper's articles, found respectively at pages 223 and 371 of that book, are entitled The Reconstruction of Beliefs and the Theosophical Society and the Faith to Come. Hooper said beliefs fell into 3 stages. 1. Universal acceptance. 2. Total disbelief. And 3. Reconstruction. The job of the Theosophical Society, concluded Hooper in the reconstruction portion of those 1904 presentations, was to synthesize differing beliefs and to reconstruct same. The forms of the reconstruction would be dealt with in this chapter about the faith to come. These days, the Theosophists and their fellow New Age travelers usually call that the New World religion. Hooper told his fellow Theosophists that they should downplay obvious theosophical propaganda. Theosophists were to share in the following work to achieve their aims. Quote, international cooperation, political work, social movements of every kind, religious and mystical cults, the strange reconstructive impulses of long-sleeping national and racial life, to be gruesomely acted out in the 1930s and 1940s by Germany and other eugenic disciples of theosophical lore, as was Hitler himself. Yes, pause again. Hitler was a New Ager. And he got a lot of his strange beliefs from Blavatsky. He read her book, all about the Aryan race, and all that came from her. Those going forth from Theosophy to evangelize the world to that mindset were to carefully camouflage themselves in ways that would make George Bernard Shaw and his Pygmalion, better known to us theatrically as My Fair Lady, seem as amateurs. We must learn to speak their language as one born thereto, easily, naturally, seeing its beauty and its meaning, not as one who translates laborious from a tongue he loves better, but as one who knows that the theosophical truth can be uttered as perfectly and as sweetly as in the language which to him is the more familiar. In a word, we must not take with us the phrases of the Theosophical Society. We must not take its forms, but we must take its spirit and its life. Are you not seeing this? This is also what Alice Bailey talks about, keeping the outer forms and using the same church usages of language. And now we can see this everywhere. I mean, it's in the NAR, it's Bethel Church and all those guys, but it's not just them. In urging the switch and bait, Hooper intriguingly said, quote, Sir Oliver Lodge has recently pleaded for a restatement or revision of Christian doctrines. It is much needed. The work of destructive criticism has paved the way. Now the day has dawned of constructive building up. Unquote. How to do it? Hooper gave specifics. Quote, people in the churches should be urged increasingly to learn that illumination comes from within, and that this life, which I call an independent inner life, as opposed to sacred rites and external teaching, should be led by all who can lead it. Oh, the inner life and the contemplative prayer, and it's all within you. And opposed to external teaching? That means the Bible, okay? That's what that means. The Bible. Unquote. The foregoing should be carefully contemplated, particularly in view of the writings of two who particularly bridged the occult and Christian world. Jacob Boehme, sometimes spelled Bohme, or the Blessed Bayman, William Law, and Jacob Boehme's English translator and disciple, William Law. Probably the most pernicious teaching spread by disciples of William Law, who was also Aldous Huxley's favorite philosopher, was that if one failed to go inside for wisdom, he was in a sense blaspheming the work of the Holy Spirit. Reliance on the Bible and traditional church creeds that proclaimed the one God, the virgin birth, the rising again, etc., were to be shed in favor of the birth of Christ within. Those familiar with Theosophical and Alice Bailey literature well know that one of the most prominent of the several initiations used to reach godhood was Christ being born in the cave of the heart. It was a prominent disciple of both William Law and Norman Grubb who has disseminated this heresy. His name would shock so many that I dare not repeat it here. The wheat and the tares were to grow together until the time of the harvest, and repeating this name at this time and place is more than certain to harm the wheat. Ooh. These were some of the same teachings that obviously tares sown in the bosom of the Prayer Breakfast Network. I will elaborate in my next article, part 6 of this series of the 12, who were part of the original Washington, D.C. network. They formed camps with the name Farthest Out, wrote books with open themes of We Are Gods. Here's a quote by Bill Hammond, father of the modern prophetic movement. Jesus will come back to earth and be given the kingdom that has been won for him by this man-child company, Joel's army. The manifested sons of God doctrine teaches that these sons will be equal to Jesus Christ, immortal, sinless, perfected sons who have partaken of the divine nature. They will have every right to be called gods and will be called gods. Let that sink in. They will have every right to be called gods and will be called gods. Will be called gods. Millions of gods at that. And called their allegedly Christian facilities ashrams. Ashrams is like a New Age church or center. They allied themselves with and borrowed the concepts of Frank Buchman, who had openly expressed admiration for Himmler and Hitler. The most authoritative text on the Prayer Breakfast Network, Modern Viking, the story of Abraham Verity, pioneer in Christian leadership, was written by an energetic and enthusiastic proponent of both William Law and Jacob Boehme, Norman Grubb. Norman Grubb would work this side of the Atlantic as well as influence huge segments of the missionary movement worldwide. His brother, Sir Kenneth Grubb, would work the other side of the Atlantic, also being active in the modern missionary movement as well as being chief of British intelligence during World War II, be a primary organizer of the World Council of Churches,
Is this vast right-wing conspiracy,
and co-found the International Institute of Strategic Studies, today a primary think tank for Javier Solana and his Western European Union confederates. Next in series, Names of the 12, Marion, Mrs. Amar Johnson, Calvary House, Camps Farthest Out, Frank Buchman, Dr. Frank Laubach, together with his role in the establishment of the meditation room for the United Nations and the role of this group in the initial founding of the United Nations as well as European Union structures. What was the role of the Keswick experience? Wow, I'm going to have to do some research because I don't see a part 6 here. Well, sorry guys. Unfortunately, I searched through all of her archives and I did not find a part 6. For some reason, she didn't get to that.
1880, Alice Bailey was born. She really emphasized the need for humanity to make a one-world government and a one-world religion for this theosophical Age of Aquarius idea. Alice Bailey formed the Lucifer Publishing Company in 1920. In 1922, she changed the name to Lucius Trust. Lucius Trust basically promoted the work of one of these, quote, ascended masters, who called himself Dejois Cool, who was working through Alice Bailey for some 30 years. This demonic force wrote volumes of material through Bailey, and those writings serve as the basis for all New Age thought. I mean, I almost can't be more emphatic about that. Almost every tiny little New Age concept can probably be tracked back to something in her extensive writings. But her writings are very cryptic, and they almost need a dictionary of terms in order to understand what she means by certain things. And almost no New Ager reads her work. What has happened is that the New Age gurus spend the time reading her work, and then they teach the concepts that she teaches to their followers, filtered through their own personal beliefs and eliminating all the references to New World Order and, you know, the World Teacher and all this stuff. Again, the New Ager does not need to know where the stuff comes from. They just need to believe the basic principles. Quoting Terry Melanson here, it says, Lucis Trust is a powerful institution that enjoys consultative status with the United Nations, which permits it to have a close working relationship with the United Nations, including a seat on the weekly sessions, but most importantly, influence with powerful business and national leaders throughout the world. Through its founding of World Goodwill, Lucis Trust is, quote, aggressively involved in promoting globalist ideology. Here's a quick quote to illustrate just one aspect of her position regarding the coming world government and the control that it needed. She said, in the preparatory period for the New World Order, there will be a steady and regulated disarmament. It will not be optional. No nation will be permitted to produce or organize equipment for destructive purposes or to infringe the security of any other nation. Bailey was always referencing something called, quote, the plan. This not only called for steps to begin to influence world government, but it also included a plan to spread the ideas of the Luciferian New Age in preparation for a man that they sometimes called the world teacher. This plan was admittedly to prepare the human thoughts to accept this new world order and new world ruler when he finally comes. One quote from her regarding this says, this must form the theme of all the propaganda work to be done during the next few decades, until the year 2025. A brief space of time indeed to produce fundamental changes in human thought, awareness, and direction, but at the same time a quite possible achievement, provided the new group of world servers and the men and women of goodwill perform a conscientious task. So we'll talk about this group later on, but what she's wanting them to do is to produce propaganda to essentially change human thought and awareness and direction in preparation for her new world order, in preparation for the world teacher. Another quote says, the day is dawning when all the religions will be regarded as emanating from one great spiritual source. All will be seen as unitedly providing the one root out of which the universal world religion will inevitably emerge. Then there will be neither Christian nor heathen, neither Jew nor Gentile, but simply one great body of believers gathered out of all the current religions. So you can see that she intends to produce propaganda to get the world to think the way that she wants them to think. I want to point out by showing the Luciferian roots of theosophy that it is their intense veneration of Satan and Lucifer and their hatred of God that I think makes it not all that unlikely that they could be used to promote this very important satanic aspect that is preparation for the Antichrist, because they were so given over to it. Helena Blavatsky writes that it is but natural to view Satan, the serpent of Genesis, as the real creator and benefactor, the father of spiritual mankind.
Run.
There's just one name that can keep you out of hell, and it's the name of Jesus. The name of Jesus.